Hello, and welcome to Roll for Topic. I'm Chris Salzman.
And I'm Andy Rao.
And this week, we have a very special episode. Andy just returned from Gencon, and I want to ask him a bunch of questions. So we thought we would do this on air as a special episode of the podcast. Yeah, so I'm curious, I guess, how many times have you been to Gencon? I guess this is not the first time you've been, I know that much, but have you been for the past 20 years?
Let's see. I have been to maybe 6 or 7 Gen Cons. That might, between 5 and 7 Gen Cons, I would say. I started going to Gen Con in the early 2000s, and I kind of started as an excuse to kind of meet up with a grad school friend who lives out of state and who I don't see face to face except at Gen Con. And since then, he and I have typically met up at Gen Con and like gotten a hotel room together. And for a little while, I alternated with the Origins game convention in Ohio, which is also a great convention.
I was down in Indianapolis kind of by accident last time Gen Con was going on, so a year or two ago. And I found it to just be utterly overwhelming. I mean, we went out to go get some food, and it was just like tens of thousands of nerds out on the street. I guess, there's thousands of people there, so you're mostly meeting up with that one friend. Are you also, like, playing with other folks that you've just met, or do you have other friends that also meet up there?
I have quite a few people that I know who go down to Gen Con as well, but largely because I can see those guys back here at home, I don't usually connect up with them at the con. Every now and then I've carpooled down with one or two of them. But yeah, Indianapolis is bonkers around Gen Con. Like every single restaurant within like a mile radius of the convention center like changes its menu to have like D&D themed foods and stuff like that. And there's signs, and everywhere you look, it's just Gen Con nerds. It's really neat actually. And people dressed up as Wookiees.
Yes, of course. Yeah, I don't really take you as a cosplayer, so I'm guessing you did not dress up as a Wookiee or otherwise.
I did not. I don't have the patience or commitment to do the cosplaying. But I have a question for you, Chris. What would you guess was the most prominent or the most common cosplay costume that could be found at Gen Con this year, according to my anecdotal note?
Oh, goodness. I would guess it's either a Pokemon thing or a Fortnite thing. Because I think kids have moved on from Minecraft, right, to Fortnite. Maybe Pikachu or that, like, banana thing from Fortnite?
Those are very good guesses. And, yeah, very good guesses. And there are a lot of Pokemon people there, and you can tell because at any given time, about 80% of the people around you are looking down and playing Pokemon Go. But,
yes,
yes. I know this because I was one of those people, but the costume I saw most often was a Scoops Ahoy costume from Stranger Things. Yes.
That's amazing.
A ton of people, male and female, dressed up as Scoops Ahoy in plays.
That is fantastic.
Yes.
I bet TCBY was a little annoyed that they didn't have some sort of tie-in.
Yes. These Stranger Things probably approached them and they were like, nah, this won't go anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. Although, for all I know, they probably did have some sort of massive booth there.
Oh, yeah, probably. There are hundreds of dealers, so.
Okay, so, I think probably, like, anyone can get a recap of Gen Con most places. So we should probably focus a little bit on sort of the core of what our podcast is about, which is about GMing stuff. So, I'm curious, did you GM anything? Did you get to play in anything?
I did not GM anything. And in fact, I have never GM'd anything at Gen Con. Every year I go and I think, maybe next year will be the time that I GM something, but I have yet to host an event at Gen Con. But I did play. I played in a ton of things, almost exclusively role-playing games this time around, although in the past I've done board games and war games and stuff too. But I had a little bit of extra time in between role-playing games on one of my days, so I actually went to a couple seminars. There's like dozens and dozens of seminars about all different topics, and every year I look at them and I'm like, I should go to more seminars, but they're always like smack dab in the middle of a game. So this year I went to a couple. Maybe next year I might reserve like a full half day to do some seminars.
Were any of them useful, or were they just interesting topics?
Yeah, super interesting actually. And there was a ton that were really interesting looking that I couldn't get to. The most interesting one, it was like a seminar given by a middle school teacher on the topic of how to get middle school aged girls into role playing.
Oh, great.
Yeah, she runs a role-playing club at a school that is largely girls, and my daughter is exactly that age, and I have idly thought about doing some sort of organized role-playing thing for her class, So, but even if I don't do that, it was really interesting to hear the perspective just about like what girls that age are looking for when they play a role-playing game, and like what is going to appeal to them, and what you need to be aware of.
Yeah, was there any easy conclusion from that? I mean, was it just like, well, you have to play Pathfinder because actually girls really love Pathfinder at that age? Or
one of the things that stood out is I asked something I have long wondered about gaming with kids. So I'm sure you've noticed that in the last like 5 years especially, there's been a ton of really well-produced games that are aimed at kids, basically. There's No Thank You Evil and Hero Kids and just a bunch of other games. And those games are about making role-playing a kid, a heroic kid. And I have always wondered, is that what kids really want to do? Or is what kids want to do to like role-play an adult adventurer in D&D? You know, like, so if you're a kid, what is your role-playing fantasy like this? Is it to play a heroic version of yourself? Or is it to be Aragorn? I don't know the answer to that question. And the seminar lecturer's answer was that it was about half and half in her experience as to what kids wanted. And she had run a game of Tales from the Loop, which she said fell flat because the kids got bored playing themselves or versions of themselves. So that was really interesting. Food for thought. Like there's no immutable law of GMing and kids there. It's going to vary, but I thought it was interesting.
That's kind of fascinating because like most kids are pretty narcissistic, so you'd assume that they'd want to just play themselves.
Yeah, there's that certain sense of, maybe when they sit down, they're like, I don't want to be a kid. I want to be Conan.
Yeah, it's kind of fun. I mean, when I played Kids on Bikes, like most of the players ended up wanting to play characters who were younger than themselves, which I think is just kind of one of those things where once you're an adult, you're like, well, no, actually, it was pretty great back then. So
yes.
Yeah, go do that. Yeah, so I guess what were the games that you got to play?
So I played quite a few games, and I guess one bit of advice if you are going to Gen Con is to do what I finally did this year, and that is like take the time to really sit down and schedule your events well in advance instead of like half scheduling your time at Gen Con and then like having to schedule stuff at the last minute at the con. But yeah, I queued up a bunch of role-playing games, and the ones that I think made the biggest impression on me were one I heard about from a guest on this podcast. I forget who it was. Maybe you remember. But do you remember the Mothership role-playing game that was mentioned?
I don't know.
Mothership is it's a super lo-fi RPG, but it won an award at Gen Con. But it's about replicating the experience of like an Alien movie or like Event Horizon type of space horror.
Ooh.
It's super interesting, and there's a risk this is going to be the game that I can't shut up about in future episodes. I should warn you. Yeah. But what's interesting about it, and if you're listening to this, please go check it out. It's not that the game itself is amazing. Like the game itself is perfectly fine, and I really enjoyed the game I played of it. But man, you got to look at the graphic design of the rulebook. It's a pamphlet. It's like maybe 40 pages or something like that, and whoever did the graphic design is just a genius at packing information into a really compact but readable format. And I don't know if I've ever read a rulebook that screamed, I am meant to be played, not read, more than the Mothership rules. I don't mean this as an insult exactly, but a lot of gamebooks are pretty long beasts, and I suspect that at least part of the intended use for them is just to read and enjoy reading them. But this is a game that is just all about playing it. It's a little hard to describe, but if you check out the rulebook online, I think you might see what I mean.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to have to pick that up. That sounds fascinating. And Event Horizon is like the movie when I think about scary movies that sticks out to me. I watched it super late one night, and it's just, it was awful.
Yes, it is also memorable in my life too. A bunch of my grad school friends and I once rented it, and it didn't really, somehow we didn't realize it was a horror movie, and we had to stop it. Like, I can watch horror movies, but man, I had to stop that one. Got a little rough.
I want to pick that up and read it just because I think I've been thinking a lot about setting tone in games and how you set that and get away from just like slapstick fantasy as the default. And it sounds like that game might have a lot to say about how to do that.
Yes, and it does something else that I love and I wish more games would do, and that is it puts the game rules on the character sheet. So you can hand somebody the character sheet and it's got like the basic, it's got all the numbers on it, but it's got like the information you need to like actually use those numbers on the character sheet. And that saves having to like make up a cheat sheet or something like that. And it gives you something to read through when it's not actively your turn in the game. And I just think that's a great idea and more games should do it.
Okay, so aside from Mothership, was there anything else that you played that was good?
I played a number of other good games. I played a game of Delta Green. It's a setting from the 1990s for Call of Cthulhu. It was sort of taking the Cthulhu mythology and making an X-Files inspired game out of it. So you play conspiracy agents, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. It recently kickstarted and got like an overhaul or a revision in the last couple of years. So I played that. And that was a kind of fun story. I showed up I was a little bit late because I'd had trouble finding the room. I showed up to the game table and the GM was like, "Oh, you can definitely join, but that guy over there is running the same scenario and he needs a couple more players to make it work. So could you just join that table?" So I said, "Sure, no problem." So I sit down and I look up and the GM is Greg Stolze, who is the author of Delta Green and the author of many fantastic games that I really admire over the last 10 or 15 years. So, and it turns out he's as fantastic a GM as he is a game writer. So,
oh, wow, that's so cool.
It was super fun. So I played Delta Green. I played the new edition of Eclipse Phase, which is also space horror, but it's sort of like transhumanist space horror. So that was fun. And then I played a playtest game of a game called Cthulhutech.
Okay.
Which it's got a new edition underway, and it's sort of the Cthulhu mythology. You may have noticed a certain Lovecraftian theme in the games I played. Mm-hmm. It's the Cthulhu mythology mixed with anime mecha, basically. So
okay.
I played some other stuff too, but those are the ones that really stood out.
That's really great. Yeah. So did you pick up any like good GM tips? Especially when you're playing Delta Green.
Greg Stolze was just a fantastic GM. So what I took away from that game is that, I realized that over the years I have become more hesitant or shy about communicating at length in the character of NPCs. Lately, I kind of default a lot to saying, the dwarf tells you this in response to your question, instead of putting on my best terrible Scottish accent and speaking the words, as if I were the dwarf. And part of that's just shyness and not wanting to look dumb or an insecurity about how good a job I'd be able to do of representing an NPC. But I tell you, there was a moment in this game where an NPC had died. 2 NPCs were coming along with us on the mission, and they were brilliant scientists who were like really unsuited physically for like the stresses of the mission. And one of them died as a result of that. And so we were just going through this kind of routine stuff, and I had my character go over and we were trying to comfort the surviving scientist. And Greg and the GM got into the character of the scientist, and he delivered like this several minute long, just incredible little speech that he clearly was coming up with on the spot. He hadn't scripted it out or anything like that. This incredible speech just about what a waste it was that this, brilliant man with the brain power to make a real difference in the world had just been thrown away on this dumb mission for the U.S. government. And it was a strangely moving experience. And it's hard to create a moving experience when you're in a really loud room. There's like 50 other people playing D&D next to you, and they're all shouting about kobolds. It made me think I'm never going to be brilliant at acting out NPCs, but man, that sure worked. And if I could capture at least a little bit of that, then it would be worth me starting to do that a little bit more. So,
yeah, I too don't really do that as well as I should. And every time that I do sort of just rely on like, no, you have to talk to the NPC. It's always a good moment. It's hard to do, right? Because it's easier to just sort of stop and be like, okay, well, here's the information I actually need to convey to you so you can move on with stuff. But yeah, anytime you can just go for it, it's going to be better than worse. I mean, yeah, it's like, even if it falls flat, it's like, so what? You're playing a game, but I mean, exactly. It's still hard, right?
Yeah. I mean, the people at the table are your friends. They're not sneering at you. Probably
No. Yeah, well, maybe.
So there was one other takeaway I took from my Mothership game, and this is a technique I absolutely am going to start using. In the Mothership scenario we were playing, we had a time limit in the setting of 7 hours to complete our mission. Mm-hmm. And the GM didn't say what would happen when that 7 hours ended. It seemed like it probably wouldn't be good. We've all been in games where there was some sort of time limit, and I think we all have had that experience of not knowing the best way to track time. Do you keep track of how much time is elapsing in the game world and just guesstimate it as best you can? I've had GMs, use an actual real-time clock, but that doesn't feel quite realistic either. But what this GM did is he drew a circle that we could all see. He could do a circle for each hour that we had remaining. He drew it on a piece of paper in the middle of the table. And then he split each circle into 3 segments. And he said, each of these segments is 20 minutes. Every time you guys do a major action, I'm going to fill in one of these segments, like knock 20 minutes off of your time, basically. And he said, also, I have a clock here, and every 5 minutes, I'm going to fill in a segment. And it worked wonderfully. It generated so much tension, and there's just this, because there were 2 triggers that would cause the GM to fill in time. He was filling in time regularly, and so you were constantly having your attention called to the fact that your time was ticking away. It just created this wonderful tension, because at first, it seems like, oh, we've got 7 circles, we have all the time in the world. But then by the time you get about 2/3 of the way through, you realize, like, oh my goodness, we really have like a finite amount of stuff we can do here. So we need to start really prioritizing what's important to us.
Yeah, I like that a bunch. So did you find at the end sort of that session that you were racing against the clock, or did you plan stuff out pretty well by the time you saw kind of that last circle getting filled in?
We were racing against the clock, because what happened is we had two kind of goals, 2 or 3 goals. We had to figure out what's going on in this, abandoned facility. We had to rescue any survivors, and we maybe had to retrieve some information or something like that. And so what happens is you just start doing the math and realizing, I don't think we can do all of these things. So what's more important, getting the survivors out? Or is it more important just to get out ourselves alive? And I mean, there was a moment where there was 40 minutes left, and it's like, we know there's a survivor in this room on the other side of the base. Do we dare go, and are we going to risk it? I don't know. It created some great moments.
That's super cool. Did you learn anything while you were playing some games about stuff that you want to make sure you absolutely never do?
This is maybe the first Gen Con in a while where none of the games was like a total bust. Mm-hmm. I don't say that to be overly negative, but it's just going to be inevitable that when you play in games with strangers, eventually you're going to play in games that just aren't in your style, or have people that just aren't your style of player or GM. This time around, I didn't have any games where the GM or the players were really phoning it in or doing a bad job. But there was one game that was a little bit of a dud. And on reflection, thinking about it later, the problem was it was kind of a short scenario, and it was set up at the beginning. We, the players, were invited to basically figure out a way. I'm trying to be a little vague here because I don't want to name the event, because I don't want anyone to feel bad. But so we were invited to make up a fairly complex plan for rooting out some traitors, let's say. So we spent a good while thinking about how we were going to do this. We had to infiltrate this facility. We had to identify where the traitors were. We had to take action to stop their plan from happening. And that was all very fun. That was really cool. And so we carried out that part. But then, once our plan swung into effect, the traitors basically just jumped up and attacked us all. And then the rest of the game was a big, drawn-out fight scene. And, the fight was fine. But I realized that, no matter how interesting our plan was, it would have just always ended with, just the way that it played out, it would have always just ended with, us just getting to a big gunfight with the bad guys.
Yeah.
And there was no, the way the scenario was set up, there was no way that, a plan that didn't boil down to, just shoot and kill the bad guys would have worked. And so I guess what I took away from that is, well, first of all, try to not create a scenario where there's really only one way that has to end. And if for some reason you have a scene like that, don't make them waste time on planning and stuff that in retrospect they're going to feel like they didn't really get to carry through on. I mean, it was a fine game, and I'm not like bagging on the GM or even really the scenario, but it wasn't the greatest.
Yeah, I've absolutely made that mistake more than once, right? Where you're just like, well, it has to happen this way, otherwise I don't have any way to get them from this point to that point. Yeah, as soon as you find yourself writing that sort of like scenario where it's like, well, if they don't follow, then there's no more game, then you're in trouble. So it sounds like you get a chance to be a player at Gen Con more so than you do sort of in the rest of your life. Do you find like that you leave Gen Con like just like hyped up, ready to run a bunch of games, or are you sick of it and you want a couple weeks off?
I left Gen Con very hyped up to run games, and that it's a great break from GMing for me, and I get to sit back and kind of quietly learn from other GMs and maybe occasionally critique them. But like every time I go to Gen Con or even smaller cons, it doesn't have to be Gen Con. If you play in like 6 games, you're going to learn something from someone, right? Because one of those GMs is going to have just a real simple little trick that you can add to your arsenal. It definitely happened this year. I bet I could identify something I've picked up from every con I've been to almost.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Like I know you came back and we've been chatting a little bit about Band of Blades, which you picked up.
Yes, Band of Blades was my big RPG acquisition this year, and it looks so good, Chris. We're going to be talking about Band of Blades on this podcast too much, I can tell.
Yeah, I apologize in advance if anyone's like, well, I don't like Blades in the Dark or Band of Blades, because that's what this is just going to be. Yes. But I mean, like, kind of hearing and seeing some of your enthusiasm for that, and just like you're already thinking about how you're going to run it and everything. It's like, oh, that's great, right? Yeah, I mean, I would say like it's not like you're unexcited about the games that you're running, but I can see there's like an enthusiasm there that you didn't have before Gen Con.
Yes, absolutely. Something else you get from a con like this, and I'll say this despite not having taken advantage of this very much this year at Gen Con, but at Gen Con you can play in games that like you are never going to be able to play in your home group for whatever reason, right? Whatever you're kind of interested in doing, someone's running it at Gen Con. And on a more extreme sense, I mean, there's a lot of types of games that like you just literally couldn't play like in your home group. The friend I was at Gen Con with, for instance, attended a 100-player war game simulating an aerial battle from World War I. Like, you can't do that anywhere else. Something else my friend and I were kind of enviously laughing at is like there was like 100-person like Star Trek UN, like Star Trek model UN. And
yes.
Like when else could you do this, right? I mean, I guess you could coordinate something online, but man, at Gen Con, there's like 500 things like that going on.
That's fantastic.
Yep.
You just sold me on going to Gen Con next year, I think, with the Star Trek UN.
Yeah, you really need to go to one of the Origins or Gen Con, I think, one of the 2 biggies. It's worth it. I mean, the small cons are awesome, and I love smaller local cons too. But once in your GMing life, everyone needs to go to a 50,000 person nerd convention like this.
Yeah, well, I don't have anything else that I really wanted to ask you, so thank you for doing this. Is there any other sort of parting shots about Gen Con you wanted to talk about?
I think we've covered everything. Yeah, it's a really good experience, and if you're a GM, it's fun to go and play, but if you are a GM, there's just so much you can pick up by going and playing in other people's games and seeing what other people do better than you, and maybe occasionally seeing what you do better than everybody else. That's nice.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And thanks to everybody who's listening to this. This was a little bit outside of our normal format, but we thought it'd be a fun thing to talk about because, Gen Con is Nerd Christmas, right? It's the once a year gigantic event that everybody knows about and seems like everybody goes to.
Yeah. And next time we'll be back to our regular format. Have no fear. Or at least soon we'll get back to it.
Yeah, soon we'll get back to it. Soon we'll have guests. Soon we'll have new guests and all that. It's going to be great. But, thanks again for listening. Please drop us a note if you have been enjoying this. If you have any follow-up kind of questions about Gen Con, or if you went yourself and have some stories to share, we'd love to hear those too. But I've been Chris Salzman.
And Andy Rao.
Thanks so much. Oh, and remember, if your players are having fun, you're a great GM. Even if you went to Gen Con without them.